Ada Wong is one of the most captivating video game characters, ever, despite never getting her own full-length game. She's been voiced by several voice actresses since her debut in Resident Evil 2 all the way back in 1998. She's a mysterious and seductive spy, traits which have come to define the character and her voice actresses in some pretty interesting ways. For the Resident Evil 4 remake, Ada was voiced for the first time by a Chinese-born Canadian actress, Lily Gao. All of Ada's main performances before Lily were performed by white women. The two I want to focus on in particular are Sally Cahill, who voiced Ada in the original Resident Evils 2 and 4.
Need a ride, handsome?
And Gillian Anderson, who voiced her in the Resident Evil 2 remake in 2019.
Name's Ada.
She was also voiced by Courtney Anderson in the movie Resident Evil Damnation, as well as Operation Raccoon City, and the infamously polarizing Resident Evil 6, but since fans aren't particularly warm to those games, I'll be focusing primarily on the performances of Sally Cahill, Gillian Anderson, and Lily Gao. Of all these Adas, there has only been one who has received such toxic criticism from fans to the point that she's been left with no choice but to deactivate her social media entirely, that being Lily Gao. Sally Cahill and Gillian Anderson's performances have been universally praised for being faithful interpretations of the role. These women nailed the mysteriousness and sensuousness of Ada, Sally with a sensual throaty cadence,
All right, we'll do this your way, for now.
And Gillian for a more fun reading. But Lily's most recent Ada has been called bland and monotone. Some went so far as to DM her, letting her know that she ruined the game for them. Even SphereHunter said her performance as Ada was the worst part of an otherwise perfect remake of one of gaming's most beloved sequels.
Even though pretty much every character and plotline has been improved, there's one that is undeniably worse than the original game. That unfortunately being Ada's role in the story. Her appearances are as limited as her acting and writing capabilities. Her story is basically absent, and it really sucks because Leon and everyone else are just perfect in this game. And when Ada shares a scene with anyone, it's like she, as a character, is so disconnected from reality. She also sounds really bored.
Personally, I love all three takes on Ada. Sally Cahill's Ada in RE298 was my gateway into becoming a superfan of the series. But I was also 11, and the bar for voice acting was far lower back then. In fact, in the 90s, Resident Evil was notorious for its blatantly awful voice acting.
I don't know what happened.
Joseph! No! Don't go!
Barry! Where's Barry?
Her attire is badass without being overtly sexualized, a red halter top with black leggings. It's an iconic performance. You really get a sense that Ada is strong and resilient, but also putting up a front. Like the movie she's based off of, 1990's La Femme Nikita, Ada falls for Leon after being pretty deceptive about why she's in Raccoon City. And let's be real here, who wouldn't fall for this boy toy?
I think I'm cute. I know I'm sexy. I've got the looks that drives a girl wild.
Gillian Anderson's performance in the 2019 remake doesn't sound anything like the sensual Ada that established the character, but it's still a fine performance. Capcom chose voice actors who could pull off younger sounding voices, since Leon and Ada are 6 years older by the events of Resident Evil 4. It's a nice touch, and again, I don't mind either of their performances here. Ada's mysteriousness is revealed here through her initial visual presentation, which abandons her distinct red look for a brown trench coat and sunglasses, in homage to Bridget Lynn's performance in the 1994 classic Chungking Express. In the original RE2, Ada reveals to Leon she's dating an Umbrella researcher and she's there to find him. But Ada doesn't have feelings for him, she's only doing it to gain access to expose Umbrella. In the remake, this storyline is nixed entirely. After escaping the police station, Ada reveals to Leon simply that she's here to stop Umbrella. Leon takes a bullet for Ada from evil corpo scientist Annette Birkin, and we get Ada's grand reveal of a red dress, black nylon stockings, and high heels? Not the most pragmatic attire, but we'll let it slide. The trench coat is abandoned for a narrative reason, to keep Leon warm as he rests up from his gun wound, giving us our brief sojourn into Ada's gameplay section. Far more vulnerable in the remake, Ada loses the upper hand to Annette's cat and mouse game by plummeting into the sewers and losing consciousness. In the original, Ada is always in control, at least until the end. Annette is the one who falls into the sewer. We only see Ada and Leon kiss before her apparent death at the hands of Mr. X in Leon's B scenario, giving it a sort of Easter egg status. In the remake, Ada and Leon kiss on the way to Umbrella's lab. Her inclusion in 2005's Resident Evil 4 was a surprise back when we were still capable of being surprised. Ada clearly died at the end of Resident Evil 2, either by falling to her death in the lab's main hub area in the A scenario, or when Mr. X violently beels her into a wall. It didn't make sense for her to return either way, and the writers make no effort to really explain her unlikely resurrection. The free market simply demanded she be returned for the gamers. Sally Cahill reprises her role here, and I thought her performance was, well, yeah. If any development team should receive blame for voice acting direction, it is the 2005 Resident Evil 4. The original Resident Evil 4 is a fascinating game for a number of reasons. It's the most popular and acclaimed of the franchise, despite being a decisive shift away from survival horror, but also for having a lot of weird moments of misogyny.
I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude!
How rude!
Its sexism was accepted, I think, for two reasons. One, though the standards of voice acting had improved by the mid-2000s, video games were still in an awkward teenage phase of edgelord supremacy. And two, 9/11 had happened, which kinda halted the West's cultural sensitivity. Sally's performance in RE4 is brief. The work that is there is far more campy and flirtatious, but where the portrayal really goes over the top is in her red dragon dress. The RE2 remake's dress is skimpier, but the one in RE4 is far more egregious in its shameless stereotyping of Asian women. And I think this is where we begin to see the more problematic side, not only to representation, but to fans' ignorance. Resident Evil 4 depicted Ada as more of an exotic stereotype, a submissive dragon lady who existed now less as a character within the world of Resident Evil and more of a generalization marketed to and made for a mostly Western American audience. Edward Said's concept of Orientalism defined it as a method employed by imperialist nations like Britain, France, and the United States to categorize vastly different geographical and cultural spaces into one homogeneous whole, the Orient. The Orient represented the East, or other, or anything antithetical to the values of Western liberal democracy. It was an incredibly reductive system of categorization. The Orient was a space that could be understood only through the mediation of the West's superior values, and it could be a number of different countries and cultures. Not only could it include Near East or Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Egypt, and Afghanistan, it could also lump in the Far East countries and cultures like China, Japan, and Korea. Hell, it could even mean South Asia, its most famous country being India. The US government used the aftermath of 9/11 to portray the Middle East as being comprised of nothing but dangerous terrorists, instilling its citizens with levels of panic that probably made people who lived through the Cold War nostalgic for the return of nuclear threat. That's a joke. But the panic was being more widely broadcast on television. News coverage was now an endless 24-hour cycle. During the Gulf War in 1991, CNN proudly showcased the dominance of the US as it bombed its technologically inferior enemy into oblivion, its broadcasters treating it like it was a blowout in the NBA. This wasn't like Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. The uncertainty was gone.
What are you shooting at, soldier?
What the fuck you think I'm shooting at? Son? I'm sorry, sir. They're out there by the wire, but I think I killed them all. Oh, you ain't shot shit, man. Listen.
Islam was looked at as a religion of suspicion, and Capcom capitalized on this panic by transitioning Resident Evil into less of a survival horror game and more of an action survival game with shamelessly racist and misogynist depictions of cultures and people in order to placate the panicked fan base in the West. It also meant that the religions that were antithetical to Christianity, namely Islam and Buddhism, could be lumped into one homogenized whole, and not only that, but they could be saved through the Judeo-Christian values of the West, of liberal democracy. Orientalism could also be used as cultural imperialism in the West to undermine other Eastern cultures, China being an especially prime example after Donald Trump's incredibly destructive 2016 presidential campaign when he blamed China for COVID, among other things. This led to a material shift in undermining any opinion that ran counter to the traditional Western narrative. Orientalism and white privilege go hand in hand because both have the privilege of cultural superiority. Lily Gao's very real experience with racism and misogyny can then be disregarded, since because she's already in the Hollywood industry, she clearly lives a life of luxury and privilege. And yet all this online abuse has caused her to withdraw from social media entirely after initially being excited to voice the role of such an iconic character. So let's go get into some of these comments. I've spliced some of them, but I want to highlight this one in particular. Bruh, they got Leon's voice so good, but Ada's make her sound like a trashy white lady in a Walmart. Like, this is so weird, and it speaks to the Redditors' ignorance and why you really shouldn't say or type anything until you've given it some thought. Like, what does a trashy white lady even sound like, you know? But this is where I have to admit, I had the same reaction when I first heard Lily Gao's Ada. My initial primal reaction was, man, she sounds like a white woman. And then I looked online to see who the voice actress was, because I didn't know. And I come to find out that Lily Gao is not only a Chinese-born voice actress voicing Ada, but she is the first woman of Asian descent to voice Ada in any Western release of a Resident Evil video game. So are you just saying that just because a person of color sounds like what you think a white person ought to sound like, that should immediately disqualify them from the role? This goes back to the Orientalism of Western culture, this elitist stance that Asians are all supposed to sound a certain way. Absolutely no one had a problem with Sally Cahill's Ada voice. It played into the tropes associated not with the femme fatale archetype, but with tropes associated with Asian women. I'm not knocking Sally or her performance here. I'm only highlighting that not all Asian women sound like that performance. So before permanently deleting her Instagram, Lily Gao left 2 posts, one defining the role of white privilege in society today, and the other about Asian stereotypes that I've just been talking about. Here's the first one. For many members of the majority culture, i.e. those who identify as white in the United States, being made aware of one's classification as linked to privilege is likely not a common or welcomed experience. Indeed, many people have never been asked or required to reflect on their own privileged status, and in regards to racial identity, doing so might feel uncomfortable or even discordant with the common narrative regarding social and political changes over the years. For example, white Americans may attach the concepts of progress toward equality or being colorblind as mitigating privilege. As a result, many white Americans either may not be aware of or may avoid considering how simply being white confers special status or experiences, potentially to the detriment of others. While many Americans may not view themselves as privileged because of their economic or social status, the advantage of being in the majority racial group is real, even if often hidden. Here's the second one, and I'm only going to read the second half of it, but I'll have it spliced up here. While criticism is expected, it's not the first time an actor of color faces racist and sexist harassment for simply participating. Inauthentic casting perpetuates an unhealthy image that further dehumanizes the community they seek to reflect. It is time we stop only capitalizing on the sexualized, eroticized, and mysterious Asian woman and make space to honor every kind of Asian woman. My Ada is a survivor. She is kind, just, intelligent, and funny. She is unpredictable, resilient, and absolutely not a stereotype. There are 2 YouTubers with a pretty wide reach that addressed Lily's criticism and her subsequent responses to the criticism. But they definitely fall into the camp of the people who don't see it as abuse and see the abuse as justified, and that Lily herself was kind of hiding behind her perceived lack of talent, behind woke behavior, The first YouTuber I'll show is from a channel called Melonie Mac Boom. Let's hear what she has to say.
My criticisms of that, I feel like that would just be a bit rude. So I do think that this is rude to do that on her personal accounts, but is it bullying? No. And is it entirely wrong that they did that? No, they have the right to do that. It's social media. It's an open platform. You know, whenever you have your stuff open, that's just how it is. I get criticism all the time about whatever I'm doing. And that's fair. That's what social media is about.
Melonie makes a fair observation about social media, but it is disappointing that instead of defending and empathizing with Lily and their similar struggles as women on social media who face constant online abuse, she basically shrugs it off saying, well, them's the brace, kid. This here's social media. This is what you signed up for. I think it demonstrates a lack of empathy with Melonie, but it gets even more frustrating in the video when Melonie mentions the post about privilege, which she dismisses as stupid.
And now all but one post has been removed from public view, which is funny because the only one that's up there is about telling white people how they should feel guilty about being white, basically, which is stupid. But I think her voice is perfect. But, oh, she's white, so of course that would be an issue for them. All right.
This is a huge red flag. Again, instead of empathizing with Lily, Melonie falsely insinuates that the post must be about how white people should feel guilty about their privilege, instead of reflecting on it in any meaningful way, which proves Lily's point. So let's get into Hero Hay's take on the matter, the other YouTuber I'm going to mention here. He mentions that while Lily may have definitely received some hateful, racist, and sexist online abuse, the fact is there's really no evidence to back that up.
I got to ask a question though. Where's all the hate, right? I haven't seen any example of the alleged hate that she's received. Now, I'm not questioning that she's received hate at all. I'm just saying, you haven't provided evidence of it. I'll presume that some of the hate was on the Instagram post that she has deleted, but you think there would be some sort of screen capture of at least like one comment.
And while I agree that there's a lot of misinformation and misrepresentation and just general narrative spinning with news articles nowadays, there's a difference between public posts that everyone can see and private DMs that only the sender and the receiver of said DM can see. And it's absolutely not Lily Gao's responsibility to screenshot these sexist and racist DMs to prove that she was harassed online. Hero Hay then mentions the main 4 tweets that the Forbes article talks about, asserting that they're not really hateful. They're just tame and in one case even kind of funny. So I'll read them off here. The first one is, you ruined the remake. I feel like I just wasted my money by buying the deluxe edition to get this VA to dub. The second one, great. Now when Separate Ways comes out, I have to put it on mute. Worst voice acting I have heard in years. Why Capcom hired you instead of the past actress is beyond me. 3. Your voice acting was horrible in the RE4 remake. It sounded super stiff and there was nothing seductive about it. It didn't fit at all. OMFG, I hope they don't hire you as Ada's voice actor for another game. And the one that Hero Hay found funny, you're a professional voice actor and this is the performance you give? Sounded like you were hungover after taking a red-eye flight after reading the lines. Like, I don't know. I find, like, yeah, these comments aren't overtly sexist or racist, but they are very hateful and they're very intense. And just reading these is like, as somebody that wouldn't even be a fan of Resident Evil or Ada or be invested in this at all, do you imagine reading these and like being particularly like, I would cringe for this type of behavior. Like, why are you putting this online, this such passionate, and I get it, like fans are passionate, but this is weird, hateful, pointless, unnecessary behavior. Like Melonie, it's the same point about social media being this brutal spectacle that you kind of just, it's the reality of the situation. He also makes the point that people who work in retail face way more actual abuse than someone like a Hollywood actress or voice actress who reads online harassment, because in one case, one is like real and one isn't.
Seriously, this stuff comes off so extraordinarily entitled to me. Like, your average retail employee has to deal with more hate and harassment probably within hours of their shift starting than what's going on here. And by the way, one of those things is happening in real life, and one of them are just like comments that you can read and like turn your screen off.
Like, I worked in retail for over a decade, and like I definitely received abuse, but it definitely wasn't as much as the black female coworkers that I worked with. They received far more. And I think this like online hate and tangible 3D matrix or whatever you want to call it hate, like they both exist. And not only do they both exist, but those two are based on their own prejudices, like racial prejudices. Like there is racism on Twitter and Instagram, and there is also racism in real life in like a real social media space. It's experienced different by a person of color in either case. And then he makes a joke about, and this is where he really gets triggered. Like, I agree, like a lot of the stuff he says is, I think, well-intentioned, but here's his blind spot. And this is where you can see Hirohei's insecurity.
For your work as a voice actress, what does that have to do with white privilege? If people don't like your job as a voice actress, what does that have to do with white privilege? I repeated the point because I don't understand. Is she behind the times by like 10 years? What does she mean? No one's been asked to think about privilege. In 2023, I think everyone watching this video has probably just today been asked to reflect on their privilege at least 1,000 times.
And he says that Lily is behind the times because everybody who has watched this video has probably had to reflect on white privilege 1,000 times already today. Now, he means this as a joke, but it's a ridiculous exaggeration by him to highlight how woke society has gotten. It's like, oh, I have to, as a white man, I have to think about this all the time. Don't worry, I think about it all the time.
You sure about that?
But instead of taking what Lily says seriously, he patronizes her and categorizes her as just like a spoiled Hollywood type who doesn't like the criticism she's facing, which he sees as, you know, very rational and justified.
Blah, 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 white Americans, blah, 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 privilege, blah, 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 detriment of others, blah, 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 social status, blah, 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 majority racial group, blah, blah, blah. Oh my gosh, man. Some people are incapable of self-reflection too, aren't they?
He also asks, well, what about the other Asian actresses who have played Ada? Don't they exist? Jungo Minagawa is Ada's Japanese voice actress, but that is not the voice Western audiences will hear. It's supposed to be some sort of big gotcha moment, but in regards to the Western releases of Resident Evil, what Lily says is factually correct. She is the first Asian woman to voice Ada in a Resident Evil video game in the West, if we want to be hyper-semantic about it. She was voiced by Shannon Chan Kent in 2017's Pocket Fighter, a game that A, isn't a Resident Evil game, and 2, sold so poorly and was so obscure that it was discontinued by Capcom the next year. And he contradicts himself by initially making the valid point that Lily Gao was going to be held under scrutiny for voicing such an iconic role, but then pretty much retracts that when he thinks he's made his point about a performance in an obscure video game that was never going to come close to the same levels of scrutiny. I will say that in both cases, the YouTubers point out that everyone's criticism could have been directed at Capcom instead of Lily, so I want to make it clear here that Hirohei, Melonie Mac, Boom, and the fans who criticize their performance as bland or monotone, and it having nothing to do with her race or skin color, are certainly not as bad as being an overtly racist caricature online, but it is still disappointing how they fail to see Lily's point about white privilege and the symbolic violence it continues to reinforce. Peggy McIntosh highlights this hidden symbolic violence beautifully in her 1989 short article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which I'll link in the description. So if you think I'm being too woke, this was a white woman addressing this over 35 years ago. She writes, quote, "I see a pattern running through the matrix of white privilege, a pattern of assumptions which were passed on to me as a white person. I could think of myself as belonging in major ways and of making social systems work for me. I could freely disparage, fear, neglect, or be oblivious to anything outside of the dominant cultural norms. Being of the main culture, I could also criticize it fairly freely," end quote. This makes me think of the French singer Aya Nakamura and the endless battle she must face with the French and, let's be real, mostly white bourgeoisie, facing endless abuse for not sounding French enough in her lyrics. But whenever she defends herself by being critical of these norms, she is seen as ungrateful for her success, not only as a black woman, but a confident one. Lily Gao stood up for herself, and instead of people listening, they doubled down on their ignorance and used their invisible privilege to add to the fire. More from Peggy. Quote, "I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets which I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. For me, white privilege has turned out to be an elusive and fugitive subject. The pressure to avoid it is great, for in facing it, I must give up the myth of meritocracy. Many doors open for certain people through no virtues of their own," end quote. Meritocracy is exactly what Melonie and Hirohei are defending here. It's not about her race, it's about talent, and Lily ain't got none. And she certainly doesn't have any when she tries to defend herself. Hirohei's take is especially troubling because he uses his platform to patronize a woman of color while reminding his audience that they all think about their privilege at least 1,000 times a day. One final word from Peggy that perfectly illustrates the intersectionality between white privilege and being a man. Quote, "I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege, as males are taught not to recognize male privilege," end quote.
Some people are incapable of self-reflection too, aren't they?
The most level-headed but still wrong criticism of Lily's performance wasn't directed at her, but at Capcom for their apparently poor direction with Lily and the character. But Lily Gao has admitted it was her interpretation of the character. It was her ideas that Capcom decided to go with. So shout out to Capcom for having the courage to stick with Lily's performance for what was surely to be a controversial thing, the release of Separate Ways. Separate Ways was originally an add-on to the original Resident Evil 4 before the days of downloadable content was called DLC, but it didn't flesh out Ada's character in any meaningful way. It was simply additional gameplay with Ada swapped in as the playable character, experiencing the events of RE4 in reverse order from Leon, namely the island, then the castle, then the village. Ada's role in the RE4 remake is brief, and the reason why is that her story is saved for the remake of Separate Ways, which is now fully fleshed out DLC. Not only was Separate Ways a substantial gameplay add-on now, it was going to be the most substantial story-driven piece of content the character ever had. It released 6 months after RE4R, which also means 6 months after so much of the attention given to the remake was centered around Lily Gao's performance. Separate Ways would see her in the leading role, with 6 hours worth of main story content, and fortunately Separate Ways was rightly received with universal acclaim.
Why am I not surprised?
Initial critics of the new Ada were now getting used to the new voice, as it rightly should have been after the remake. To me, it is the most seductive Ada yet, but maybe not in a way we've seen before. Fans who despise Gao's performance seem to want consistency with the tone of her voice above all else. The problem with her performance is that it is at times sarcastic and cold and ironic in a way Sally and Jolene's Adas never were.
That is one hell of a greeting, Ada.
You don't seem surprised. Interesting.
Try using knives next time. Better for close encounters.
Not a bad move. Very smooth.
So who are you working for this time?
Oh, Leon. You know I don't work in town.
There's a pinned tweet by pro wrestler CM Punk that I think sums up a lot of fan critique culture rather perfectly. Some of you need to stop listening to criticism from people you wouldn't ask advice from. Really glad Capcom and Lily didn't allow these criticisms and abuse to influence the final product, because Separate Ways really nails it in a way a Resident Evil game really hasn't before. In an interview done in 2020 with Geek Network, Gao acknowledges that it would be unwise to eliminate Ada's sexuality altogether.
And I think change is good. And, like I said, the sexualization of women has been around since, I don't even remember, but it will be around forever. And you don't have to take away everything about her that makes her sexy, because if you're showing a sexy woman on camera, it can be a very empowering thing. But how do we empower a human without just distilling them down and putting them into a little box of this is exactly what she is, and she just fights in a sexy outfit and that's it?
What so many people seem to miss about the new Ada is how seductive she actually is. Lily Gao's Ada is seductive because she is the most willing to give vulnerability to Ada and rejecting past interpretations of her with this vulnerable dimension. You might not think seduction and vulnerability have any relation, but Jean Baudrillard's Baudrillard theory of seduction can offer some clarity here. Baudrillard? I can't say French names. Seduction opposes universality and normality by operating not on the level of truth, but on the level of appearance. It's a superficiality that exposes imperialist power structures for being rigid and unchanging. Seduction is playful, it thrives on enigma, and we need the relationship between seduction and power in order to problematize rigid truths, which aren't rooted in any essential or primordial facts, but rather by the intervention of human thought, which reify concepts like biology into scientifically rational truths we then come to take as stone-cold truth. The antagonism between power and seduction allows us to see the inconsistencies in rigid, essentialist thought. It's like trying to define hot without the concept of cold. Seduction can only be defined in relation to power, but it is always there to undermine it. Hyper-reality is our reality today. It blends spectacle with real lived experience. But unlike the Matrix, there isn't a distinction between reality and hyper-reality. Instead, they work together to produce a reality that is more real than real. And in a hyper-reality that tries to rationalize everything, mystery and seduction have begun to disappear. Something like porn completely overrides seduction. Instant gratification. So you get obvious and cringe comments like this guy saying, I don't know whether Ada wants to sleep with me or kill me. With the demystification of women after the first and second feminist movements, they were no longer categorized into cliches like goddess, mother, or femme fatale. Ada is not a cliche, despite her character being based on one. What does this have to do with the Resident Evil 4 DLC Separate Ways? While Baudrillard didn't believe that men essentially only had masculine characteristics and women essentially feminine ones, I think his theory on the relationship of power and seduction can be applied to the roles Wesker and Ada play in the game. Albert Wesker's presence has loomed over the entire Resident Evil franchise in some pretty weird ways over the years. He was originally killed in the first game back in 1996 after being revealed to be a mole within the STARS task force, who was actually a high-level operative with the Umbrella Corporation. He was resurrected in Code Veronica after being away from Parts 2 and 3, got a very small role in Part 4 in Ada's campaign, and then died off again in Resident Evil 5 after main frenemy Chris Redfield infamously punched a boulder, killing him. Now he's back as the main villain, using Ada's mercenary status as a spy to keep her well paid so she could do the things no one else can do. It's clearly an exploitative relationship. Wesker sees only her exchange value, or in other words, what she can do for him.
I have absolutely no use for your incompetence.
He is a man desperate to remind Ada of his dominance. Ada had always been a morally great anti-hero in the franchise, but by the Resident Evil 2 remake, her singular focus is taking down Umbrella. Ada deceives Wesker by running off with the Plagas cure instead of giving it to him after it is revealed to her that Wesker is nothing but a megalomaniacal villain who will murder billions in order to save a million.
All you need to know is a new dawn is breaking. 100 will give their lives so that just one may live. I am expediting that change.
So, we're talking millions of casualties.
Billions.
How ambitious? We're changing course now.
But it's pretty fair to say she already knew this. Ada plays with Wesker by claiming to use Leon, and since Wesker only understands domination, he allows their relationship to carry out. She reminds him that Leon's a dog, and a predictable one, which seems to placate Wesker. Ada is playing a dual game with both Leon and Wesker. One is someone she cares about but doesn't know if she should act on it, and the other is a coworker she must appease in order to make money.
Change of plans. Of course, you're free to refuse.
Think that gun's gonna be enough?
Interesting.
Okay. I'll do it. But cost you extra.
Wise decision. I'll send you the new coordinates. And remember, I do not like
waiting, I know.
The feminine here isn't subordinated, it is the dominant sexuality because it relates to the sign, not reality. Value is designated in the realm of signification. In Resident Evil, it's Ada Wong's world, and we're all just living in it. The Resident Evil 4 remake finishes what the Resident Evil 2 remake started in its reimagining of Ada from a manipulating, indifferent spy to a character with empathy. She cares for Leon in the incredible reimagining of the boat ride to the island. Leon confides to Ada that he's changed since Raccoon City, but when he asks her if she's done the same, she replies,
You! Leon S. Kennedy! You haven't changed. You just think you have.
So here's my question. Have you changed, Ada? Or are you just trying to use me again?
What do you think?
Leon's vulnerability is on full display. It's clear he has feelings for Ada in a way that negates the original RE4's rather banal attempt at turning him into a chauvinistic ladies' man. And Ada's vulnerability comes through in a question that obviously implies she has feelings for him, but in a subtle and interesting way that could ignite a man with passion. He doesn't know, but we know. Resident Evil has never been great at telling a thought-provoking or even consistent story, but the writing and performances in the Separate Ways DLC are refined, coherent, and mature. And after Ada disregards Wesker's order to return with the Amber Cure, he decides not to kill her. He can't because even a power-hungry idiot like Wesker is fascinated by Ada Wong and the incredibly interesting game she's playing. I try not to get too preachy with this video, but I think the main reason people were so critical of the change is a stubbornness to accept change, any change. But change is a net positive. Change is growth. Lily Gao's performance isn't just authentic in its representation, it's simply a great performance. There's really nothing else that needs to be said about it. Thanks for watching.